to US History Crash Course. I'm your host, Natalie Hollon, and today we will be learning about time period 3 from 1754 to 1800. During this time, America was still under the rule of the British, and the colonists were harshly taxed in order to remain loyal. Some of the taxes that the British enforced included the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the famous Tea Act, which led to the Boston Tea Party. Each of these specific acts were ways that the British could create revenue from all of the native colonists. Samuel Adams, the founder of the Sons of Liberty, became fed up with all the taxes, and on the night of December 16, 1773, he gathered the Sons of Liberty to attack the boats stocking the Boston harbor that held the crates of tea. The men dressed as native Indians and threw their crates of tea overboard while setting fire to the ships. This famous event would be the turning point for the colonists to rebel against the control of the British. Although the colonists didn't get what they hoped and were punished with the Intolerable Acts, this act was enforced by the British in order to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party by taking away the ability for Massachusetts to govern themselves, which enraged the other 13 colonies. Derek Johnson, do you know what the Boston Tea Party is?
Yeah, me and some of my homies turned up in Boston with some tea.
Not really. I mean, isn't that when we had a tea party with the Italians or something like that?
Incorrect. Nate Rice, what is the Boston Tea Party?
Boston Tea Party refers to people in Boston refusing to pay tax, I think, on tea that they had imported from England in the 1700s.
Correct! Eventually, when the original 13 colonies were fed up with the regulations from the British, they rebelled against them, known as the American Revolution. The coercive acts are what sparked the colonists to revolt against the British and start the American Revolution. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia from September 5th to October 16th in 1774 in order for all American authorities to come together and establish a plan to fight the British for the Intolerable Acts. The Second Continental Congress was in Philadelphia, including the 13 colonies, on May 1775. The reason for having the meeting was for the colonists to regroup and establish a strategy to fight the British during the Revolutionary War. Also, during this meeting, the Articles of Confederation were drafted among the 13 colonies. This was the first constitution in the United States and allowed the states to have one vote in the Continental Congress. However, they were not allowed to tax or enforce laws because they did not want the Confederation to seem like Britain. Another important event at this meeting was that George Washington was appointed one of the generals for the U.S. Army. Here's George Washington himself.
Hello all, I see you're learning about my time being a leader in the U.S.
Yes, well, do you mind if we ask you a few questions?
No, not at all.
How would you describe the relationships between the British and the Native Americans during this time?
Well, after the French and Indian War, the Indians did not receive the land that they had hoped and still kept fight for their native land. They also didn't have a great relationship with colonists after we used them for slavery in the encomienda system before using African Americans.
Great. Well, do you think the colonists were justified in fighting the British, even though most of the colonists were from European descent?
Well, only about 1/3 of the colonists still remained loyal to the British during the war. These colonists were called loyalists. Another 1/3 of the colonists were strictly against the British and advocated for war. The last 1/3 of the colonists could care less about who they were under.
Well, thank you for coming today.
Yeah, no problem.
The American Revolution consisted of the American colonists fighting the British rulers in order to gain independence. Most of the battles fought resulted in British victory, including the Battle of Lexington, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and the Battle of Yorktown. One of the battles was a major turning point in the war for the American colonists, the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, when General Gates and Benedict Arnold led the American colonists to a clear victory. After the war ended and the U.S. Continental Congress wrote the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, to declare the 13 sovereign states in the United States to be free from Britain control. This is why we celebrate Independence Day in the U.S. each year on the 4th of July. The U.S. wanted to write more laws and regulations, so they decided to write the Constitution, composing of 7 articles that address the roles of the government. This means that the power of the judiciary and the president was restricted. This document was also what allowed the nation to determine 2 parties, the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. Federalists were oftentimes Northeastern merchants who were opposed to the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists were oftentimes small Southern farmers who were in favor of strictly viewing the Constitution. In response to the outbreak of the two parties, George Washington, James Madison, and John Marshall wrote the Bill of Rights in 1791 to help the Anti-Federalists by promising to protect individual freedoms. The establishment of the Bill of Rights allowed Madison to please both parties and establish the freedom of the government and the American people. Under the presidency of George Washington was the whiskey tax, which was imposed on the wheat used to make whiskey in order to generate revenue to relieve the national debt. Farmers became enraged when they were being taxed to grow crops and started the Whiskey Rebellion. Alexander Hamilton was the Secretary of State under George Washington. He established the idea of having a national bank. The Bank of the United States meant that the government would be able to hold private stocks and give out loans to people. This would regulate the amount of money that the government could have by spreading out power among the people of the U.S. Since Hamilton was a Federalist, the people who agreed with this idea were also believers in the loose interpretation of the Constitution. Another major issue during this time was slavery, which was mostly in the South. African Americans from the Columbian Exchange worked on plantations because they were cheap labor. This is where the 3/5 compromise comes in. This allowed each enslaved person to be counted for 3/5 of a person in order to regulate the power of the Southern states. In 1797, John Adams was succeeded into presidency by George Washington. He was known as one of the founding fathers of America because of his major role in the start of the nation. Under his presidency was the XYZ affairs, which was when spies tried to bribe Americans to allow them to speak to French officials. Thanks for viewing, and we'll see you next week on U.S. History Crash Course.